Hello everyone. In the first video of this series I explained how to properly set up the golem and your build, which gets you to roughly 75% of the benchmark. In the second video I then went on to explain some basic DPS mechanics which should help you get to around 90% of the benchmark if you practice them long enough. You may have noticed that over the course of this series I am slowly ramping up the difficulty. So in this video we're going to talk about how to reach 95% of a golem benchmark. While I was able to keep the first two videos extremely broad and basic, unfortunately we will now have to start talking about specific builds, because every class and every spec has different requirements once you start caring about the details. So in continuation of my previous video showcasing Power Holosmith, I've decided to show my progress towards reaching 95% of the benchmark on this specific build. I'm not really an engineer player, so this will be quite interesting for me to learn the build as well. However, I obviously hope that you are able to follow along even if you're not playing engineer, and you're able to apply the concepts presented here to whichever build you care about the most. Before we get started on Holosmith's specific details though, we'll first talk about what 95% of the benchmark actually means on a philosophical level. As you have seen in the last video, 90% of the bench is mainly about queuing abilities to not waste too much time in between skill casts, having a decent idea of the opening sequence which then informs a short rotation loop, and not cancelling any of your abilities. You have put a lot of effort into learning how to time your ability inputs properly and become aware of all the actions we are taking. To get to 95%, you need to build upon this skill set to achieve two main goals. Number one being that you press the buttons in the correct order. This sounds simple, but as it turns out is very difficult on a build like Power Holosmith, because the golem takes about 95 seconds to kill, and the rotation will literally never loop around in those 95 seconds. And while there are obviously ways to get to 95%, even if the skill order is not entirely perfect, the closer to the correct order you are going to be, the better you will perform. Number two is that you press the buttons at the correct pacing. The most common mistake is to be a bit slow on your inputs, not perfectly queuing everything and thus having extra attacks or idle time slip in. If you want to reach 90% of the benchmark, it's still fine to have a little bit of downtime like that. However, if you want to reach 95%, these kinds of issues will have to be minimized. By the time we reach 95% of the bench, we will still not need to be perfect above both of those points. However, you need to be relatively close to both if you want to make it. In return, this means that if you can reach 95% of a benchmark, you have basically mastered the rotation already, at least in theory on the golem. For this reason, even top speed clearing guilds will not require their members to reach more than 95% of the benchmark before applying to the guild. Showcasing that you can do 95 on the golem is good enough for all practical purposes, even at the highest level, and growth beyond it is often considered a waste of time that could be spent applying the build in actual fights to learn more how to play it in actual fights, because when you're speedrunning, you're obviously not speedrunning golems, but you're actually speedrunning concrete encounters. So, when you think about what you're going to learn in this video, it's the essential limit, the peak of what is practically useful in terms of rotational practice on the golem. You will learn how to copy a rotation perfectly, and you will see a lot of tricks to play at the correct pace. So now let me explain my learning process on Power Holosmith. First thing we need to talk about is heat management. Heat management is both about skill order as well as about speed. When I'm too slow outside of the Holoforge, too slow at pressing my buttons, then my Holosmith will cool down too much, and inside the forge I don't gain enough heat again if I do the correct rotation. So I will leave the forge at less than 149 heat, which makes the problem worse the next time around. So for this reason, speed is very important, but it's also important that I press the skills in the correct order. I want to press 3s or 2s every time I'm outside the Holoforge, and if I don't press the skills in the right order, I don't put enough priority on sword 2 or not the correct priority on the other skills, I might not be perfectly pressing stuff off cooldown. So this makes me cool off more, even if I'm fast enough. And for that reason my heat will drop below. And that is not good for our DPS, because Holosmith's damage scales with the heat level they're at. And one of the ways we can actually gain speed is when using the grenade kit. So the grenade kit, as you might not know already, has actually two ways of leaving it. And the first way you're going to see right now, when I press the freeze grenade, I can press the grenade kit button, so button number 7, to exit the grenade kit during the cast of the freeze grenade. Simply by pressing a kit, I'm not actually cancelling the current action, so I can fully cast the freeze grenade and immediately queuing up the next ability after it without any interrupt and without any idle time in between. However, there's a problem with this strategy, and that problem appears in the second grenade kit use we have while outside the forge. When I only press one skill inside the forge, I can't actually use the grenade kit button to leave again, because whenever you enter the grenade kit puts itself on a 1-second cooldown to avoid double tapping, which is very nice of ArenaNet to think about misclicks. However, it prevents us from going into grenade kit, pressing 2 and leaving immediately after. For this reason, we have to use a weapon swap to exit the grenade kit if we only want to use one skill. So what you're going to see right now is when I leave the grenade kit, I will actually just use the weapon swap button to leave, and the problem that brings with it is that weapon swaps cancel skills. So there's two ways that I'm using the grenade kit within 5 seconds. The one way is a very nice queuing with the freeze grenade, where I can immediately leave the kit again after I started the cast of the freeze grenade. And the other one is a very careful one, where I have to wait until my grenade 2 skill has completed its cast, and only then can I leave with the weapon swap button. And this takes a lot of time to get into muscle memory that both of these ways are executed perfectly. After completing the first day of practice, I then went back and rewatched the POVs of my practice. I think it's very important that after you've spent some time practicing, you also start looking at logs or gameplay footage of yourself, so you can actually get an outside view on yourself. You will notice a lot of things you would never have noticed just by playing. And one thing that I noticed, for example, is how my fireworks relic uptime was not that good, because obviously I did rotational mistakes. The rotation is kind of tuned in a way to give you perfect uptime or near perfect uptime. And by me not following the precise skill orders, I had some gaps in fireworks uptime. So this helped me to understand the importance of pistol 5 at the correct spot and of my F4 at the right spot, etc, etc. Another trick that I learned was that actually when I press my sword 3, my character does a leap forwards, and during movement skills, you can't actually interrupt them with other abilities. So what you can do is when you exit Holoforge here, afterwards you will see me do a sword 3 into a pistol 5. Pistol 5 would be an interrupt, but since sword 3 is a movement skill, I can simply spam 5 during the sword 3 already. This lets me gain time, because then I don't have to be perfect about the skill cast of pistol 5, which is normally quite a pain, because you need to wait for the skill bar to be full of the previous ability. We have talked about cancelling abilities. One thing I learned from watching the benchmark video again is how to use pistol 4 after the Holoforge. So you want to use pistol 4 whenever you use the elite skill inside the Holoforge. Whenever you don't use the elite skill inside the forge, you want to start with a sword 2 instead. It's really important to know by heart which one you're going to do next, because there's no way to look at the cooldown. You simply have to know whether sword 2 is the one you need to press based on the cooldown of pistol 4. And for me it really helped to tie this to elite skill use in my head, so I was always able to do it correctly. When playing any build with a kit or with a different kind of weapon set, you You need to be aware of how to handle and track your cooldowns that you can't see at the moment. And it really helps to be able to tie it to a utility skill that is always on your bar, like your elite skill or any other utility. For the Grenade 2 cooldown on Engineer, it is actually just tied to Sword 2 use. So after every single Sword 2, we go into the Grenade kit and press Grenade 2 immediately afterwards. This ties naturally into the next pitfall. Whenever I'm leaving the Holoforge, I am losing time. Since Holoforge is essentially a weapon swap, it cancels the current ability. That means I always have to complete the Forge 3 ability Corona Burst before I can leave. After leaving, my character then tries to do an auto attack. However, rotation-wise, I need to immediately start with either Sword 2 or Pistol 4, depending on the use of my elite skill prior to that. That is to say, the faster I can press that next input, the better. And it's very easy to just lose a quarter of a second without ever realizing that it happened, as the visuals of the Forge changing to your normal skill bar cover up the fact your character is idling. The solution is to blindly be able to do this continuation, not waiting until you can see it, but simply letting your muscle memory act. And even more importantly, you need to flick a switch inside your brain on queuing versus not queuing. You see, during the Holoforge 3, my brain is programmed to wait until the cast bar is filled before I'm allowed to F5 to exit the Forge, since I don't want to cancel Corona Burst. However, after that, the next few abilities all need to be queued, including that I enter the Grenade kit. At least for my brain, it's very tempting to sort of wait out the cast bar of the Sword 2 before entering the Grenade kit, just because it feels right to look at a completed cast bar before pressing the next button, since I've already done that for the Corona Burst before. But this makes it so we cannot queue the Grenade 2 skill after entering the kit. That is to say, our character will idle for another quarter of a second potentially, without us ever noticing it. Because Grenade kit doesn't have an auto attack, so there's no real tell that you're idle. Potentially we are looking at a total of half a second wasted, in a basically invisible way every time we leave the Forge. And we're repeating this procedure 5 times over the course of the Golem. Naively calculated, this costs literally more than 1000 DPS, and it is invisible to the untrained eye. The logical conclusion to this issue is that our eyes and conscious thoughts are not fast enough for what we must do here. We need muscle memory to be able to take over. I realized while practicing Holosmith that my best runs always happened when my fingers just acted after leaving the Forge, without taking breaks to actively think about my inputs. In order to be able to do this, it's important to identify the sections of the rotation that allow you to think and plan ahead. For me, these sections are always the auto chains inside and outside the Forge. There you have a bit more than a second where you don't need to input anything. And you just wait for the cast bar of the third hit to fill up before pressing the next ability. Whenever I do the auto chain inside the Forge, I think about the next sequence after the Forge, to then hopefully let my fingers execute all the button presses before I can see them. I would like to cycle back to the previous video in that context. In that I told you that you should practice auto chains until they feel natural and relaxing to you. This situation right here is the reason why it needs to feel like you can take a breath. If you're under stress doing auto attack chains, there's no chance you can map out and prepare your next steps. Do not underestimate the difference it can make to be able to have a moment of respite during the rotation. As my second day of practice drew to a close, I noticed that while I still made progress on a theoretical level, as I grew more and more familiar with what I'm supposed to do in theory, in practice my hands started getting tired. And mentally I was also pretty exhausted. Whenever this happens to you, you should stop. You start to make silly mistakes, you will get frustrated by a lack of progress, and ultimately you strain your hands more than you should. For all these reasons, you need to take a break. I was at around 92% of the benchmark and wanted to see that number climb a bit more to hopefully finish this project as fast as I could. But this is the wrong approach. You cannot force improvement like that. Sometimes your brain and hands need time to process what you've learned. What I actually needed at that moment was to take a look at my recordings to hunt for more specific improvement ideas. So far in this video, we have identified the following: heat management, 2 ways of exiting grenade kit, fireworks uptime, doing up pistol 5 after sword 3 because sword 3 is a movement skill, pistol 4 priority that can be tied to the elite skill, time wasted after exiting forge, and switching between waiting out cast bars and seamless sync queuing. Reviewing the footage after day 2, I realized that with all these improvements I've made already, 95% will be very easy to get if I can just fix one more thing. When I drop below 100 heat before my last sword 2 is cast, it only fires out 3 blades instead of the full 5. Not only is that a sizable damage loss, it's also a very easy visual telling you that I'm slow at doing the rotation outside the forge. When comparing myself to the benchmark, I noticed the bench got the full 5 blades every time except once. Whereas in my tries it was really common that I got the reduced effectiveness much more often. So the last thing to do is to really work on my speed. The best way to do that is to Q more aggressively. After the freeze grenade, I can just exit the kit a bit faster to ensure a good Q after. I don't want to wait with the pistol 5 until the cast bar of the previous skill is flashing visibly. I can try to do it a server tick 40 milliseconds faster, or maybe even 80 milliseconds. This will produce more failed logs in the transition period where I'm actually just interrupting skill casts or abilities don't fire anymore because I accidentally override a queued ability. However, the difference that this can make in the long term is remarkable. At the start of the video I've talked about heat management and how being slow outside the forge makes you lose more heat than you will gain inside. What happened to me when making those speed improvements is that my time outside of the forge got so short that I did not cool down enough and ended up overheating regularly since I still had some timing issues inside the forge. Now, rather than slowing down the part outside the forge on purpose, I just diverted more of my attention towards the timing inside the forge. I looked at whether I was queuing everything correctly in there, now that it actually started becoming detrimental to my rotation. With that, I knew I would achieve my goal of 95% very soon. It was just a matter of time now. I actually realized only after the second day that there was a different benchmark that was 300 DPS higher than the one on Snowcrows and used a different rotation. So I adjusted my goal upwards accordingly, even though I decided to stick to my guns and use the weaker rotation I had practiced so far, rather than restarting the progression with a new rotation. With all this said, let us take a moment to appreciate the journey that I've outlined. The premise of the first video was to understand the benchmark settings. Setting up the training area correctly and having a full build already gets you 3/4 of the way to the benchmark. The next video was then quite a bit longer and it explained the steps to take to slowly climb towards 90% of the benchmark. This video now is already nearly 20 minutes long and we just talked about the path from 90% to 95%, which is a very small improvement that requires hours and hours of practice. In other words, at least as far as the golem result is concerned, we are hitting diminished returns. However, let us compare 3 fictional players that get to 75%, 90% and 95% of the benchmark respectively. The first player is a complete newbie, without any rotation practice. When met with actual boss mechanics, his DPS will probably plummet. The DPS at the golem is somewhat inflated for them because idle time gets filled with auto hits automatically, which is not necessarily the case in a real fight because there's movement and mechanics to deal with. The second player who reaches 90% of the benchmark will not just see 20% better results than a newbie in actual fights. All their rotation practice, the hours they have spent familiarizing themselves with the opening and the game's combat mechanics will give them a huge advantage over the newbie, which may literally cause you to do twice as much DPS. The same is true in the relationship between someone at 90% and someone at 95%. While 90% means a solid understanding of the fundamentals and a good opening, 95% is very close to perfect execution. In order to get to 95%, you need to have the rotation deeply ingrained in your muscle memory. If a distracting mechanic happens, the 95% player is much more likely to be able to carry on with the perfect rotation, whereas the 90% player may be thrown completely off balance. So the difference on the golem may look small, but since the skill gap between the 3 levels is rather big, in practice there's still more than enough space for skill expression. If you hit 95% of the benchmark, all I can say to you is that now is definitely the time to play the build in all types of content. While you're very good now at following the rotation script, and you're even good at variations based on your cooldowns, since you practiced 5 different out of forge loops based on what happened before. Now you need to start to understand what makes boss fights actually tick. How do you incorporate CC into the rotation? How can you burst right before the boss phases? What if you have to range inside the grenade kit for 10 seconds? How do you then re-enter the forge after having lost so much heat? These questions do not have a general answer. It is up to you to find answers for specific situations. One thing I like to do is watch speedrunners play the build. They often have very good ideas on how to play around a certain mechanic on a certain boss. Since getting here required you to perfectly copy the benchmark video, I'm sure following a rotational idea just for a short phase on a boss will be a walk in the park in comparison. In summary, you need to keep playing the build on encounters. You have more than enough theoretical foundation to achieve a lot in this game, and I'm excited to see where your journey leads you next. Thanks for watching this video, and I see you next time.